Well, happy Wednesday to everybody. Thank you for being here. This evening, we are going to pick up where we left off on our study of the Transfiguration on Sunday morning. And depending on how much time we have left after that, we're going to skip ahead in the text to Luke chapter 17 and look at some parables on humility. I did break this initial section down into a few points. Just some review of what we studied, a very brief review. Then we will discuss the Transfiguration a little bit more and the idea that Elijah has come. We're not going to reread this, but we saw that Peter had confessed Christ as Lord, and his confession meant that Jesus was God's anointed one and the Messiah of Israel. This is who they had been waiting for. We also discussed that Peter was the one that is usually the spokesperson for the 12, and that none of them disagreed with his confession of Christ's deity. And we also discussed that this is at the root of every person's faith throughout history. The next thing we talked about was Jesus foretelling his own death. He also told of his resurrection, which was overlooked at the time. And interestingly enough, Jesus had instructed them not to tell anybody at that time, and we discussed several reasons as to why he did that. We also talked about Peter rebuking Christ and Christ's response to him and what the reason for that was. And finally, we touched briefly on the idea of the cost of discipleship and carrying your cross and following him, to prioritize Christ in our lives and to deny ourselves. This was just a quick recap for anyone that wasn't here on Sunday morning. And I realized that we already did this on Sunday morning, but I did want to read it again so it is fresh in our minds. I apologize. It's very difficult to work on the timing of class. Sometimes you go over, sometimes you go under, and I just felt that we should still spend time on this. So let's go ahead and read this together. This is Luke chapter 9. It's on the screen, but it's Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 28. Some 8 days after these sayings, he took along Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who appearing in glory were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, but when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. And as they were leaving, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not realizing what he was saying. And while he was saying this, a cloud formed and began to overshadow them. And they were afraid as they entered the cloud. Then a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And they kept silent and reported to no one in those days any of the things which they had seen. Does anyone remember what we had said? I gave 3 reasons, but does anybody remember what the purpose of the Transfiguration is and why it was recorded for us?
One of the reasons you brought out correctly was the fact that it was showing the 3 different dispensations with Moses and Elijah and Christ.
All right.
And God said to listen to Jesus, not to Moses and the prophets.
All right. Yes, this was one that we didn't cover just now, but it was to prepare Christ for his suffering, to confirm the faith of Peter, James, and John, and to establish his preeminence and his authority above the law, above the prophets. Again, this is to prepare Jesus for the trial that's coming his way in just a few short days, and knowing that glory would follow this suffering. The next was to confirm the faith of Peter, James, and John. The truth had been revealed and confessed by Peter, but sealing this and confirming this for them affected the church throughout the rest of history, even to today. And finally was to establish Jesus' preeminence and his authority over Moses, over the prophets. He is the Son of God. Next, we started to talk about, for lack of a better term, some of the characters that were present there. And I think that's what you were getting at, Gary. Jesus represents God in the form of a human as his son. It also talks about his authority. Moses represents the law, even though he was a prophet. Moses is most categorized with the law. And Elijah, he doesn't represent all the prophets, but in this case, he's a representative of the prophets. We notice that Luke records that Jesus went up to the mountain to pray. And this, he brings along Peter, James, and John. So he has 3 people that come with him. And this is kind of reminiscent to Exodus chapter 24, where Moses went up to Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments. There were 70 other people present there, but Aaron, Nahab, and Abihu went with him, and then Moses went up to the mountain alone. But at this point, this is where Moses and Elijah did appear to him. As we discussed, Moses was the law. Everyone knew who he was, and Elijah represented the prophets. Both of these things, as we've said, Jesus came to fulfill and uphold. So, why do you think, how did they recognize that this was Moses and Elijah? What do you think? Because it doesn't say in here, but do you think this is something that maybe they heard in conversation that's just not recorded here? Was it something that was passed down that they may have recognized what they look like? It's just something that's always kind of stumped me. I don't know if anybody had any thoughts on that. We also talked that, well, Steve Crawford actually mentioned this on Sunday morning, that this shows Christ is above all. As great as they were nothing compared to Jesus. In the Old Testament, Christ was not spoken to the way he is today. God spoke to us through the prophets, and now he speaks to us through the Son. This also goes along with what the Hebrews writer was saying in chapter 3. It says, "Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. He was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses was in all his house. For he had been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, by just so much as the builder of the house is more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant for the testimony of those which were to be spoken later. But Christ was a faithful son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast to our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end." We're going to talk a little bit more about Peter's confession later, but sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself here on some of these. People had expected Elijah to return. Some people did. When John was around and Herod had asked who he was, people said that he was possibly Elijah. That was one of the responses. And when Herod asked who Jesus was, and when Jesus asked, "Who do people say that I am?" Elijah again was one of the responses. We know that Elijah was going to return. It talks about that in Malachi chapter 3, that God's sending a messenger to clear the way, and that's why people thought that John the Baptist happened to be Elijah, because he was a voice of one crying in the wilderness. He met some of the qualifications, and some people understood that, but a lot of people did not. If you want, turn over with me real quick to Matthew chapter 17, and starting in verse 5. This is Matthew's account of this, but it offers us a little bit of insight on this question to Elijah. While he was speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground and were terrified. And Jesus came to them and touched them and said, "Get up and do not be afraid." And lifting their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, "Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." And his disciples asked him, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" And he answered and said, "Elijah is coming and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah already came, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they wished. So also the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he had spoken to them about John the Baptist. I don't think this is Elijah being reincarnated. I think it was more of a metaphorical type of Elijah coming to prepare the way. Or it was just people's understanding that this was going to happen. But either way, Jesus tells them that Elijah has come. Does anyone have any questions or comments at this time?
Joe made a really good point earlier about the fact that God spoke about the Son. He didn't talk about Moses or Elijah. He singled them out. And then the other thing, too, is when Peter, James, and John looked up, they only saw Jesus. So Moses and Elijah had disappeared. So that further emphasizes the point of the good point that you made about Jesus being, better than the prophets and the law.
Anything else? Yes, sir.
Verse 3 here in the Matthew account answers your question a minute ago, how Peter, James, and John knew that they were Moses and Elijah because they had
Well, how did they know it was Moses and Elijah? How did they know it wasn't two other bearded guys? All right, we are going to move a little bit ahead. I think there we go. The mountain that we talk about is the Mount of Transfiguration. We don't exactly know where this is. Some people say that it was Mount Tabor, and other people say it was Mount Hermon. But what seems most likely from the little bit of study I've done compared to the lifetime of study that others have done is a place called Jebel Jarmuth in Upper Galilee. Has a very high elevation, rising 4,000 feet above the Mediterranean, and it's a relatively short distance to Capernaum, which is where we see Jesus soon reaches in Matthew and Mark's account. We don't know for sure, but I don't even know if it really matters. Another interesting note here that we kind of discussed was Luke is the only one that mentions that Jesus went up to pray. We talked a little bit in the baptism class that this makes sense. He knows what's before him. He wants to spend time in prayer. That's an example that we should all take to heart in our lives. And verse 29, it's back in Luke's account. Verse 29. All right. It says that while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. This is something that I feel like Peter, James, and John at that time, they would have understood this and thought about this. This is similar to what they've heard throughout their traditions and through the Old Testament about what happened to Moses when he went up to Mount Sinai. And again, when he received the Ten Commandments, it says that the skin of his face shone like the sun, and people were afraid to come near him. Matthew and Mark's accounts do give a little bit more detail as to what's going on here. We just read Matthew's. We won't go through Mark's as well, but here are the accounts in Matthew and Mark. The source of this dazzling brightness, we don't know. It's not said in here, but we can only assume that it's some sort of heavenly brightness. And 1 John chapter 3 says this is something that the Christian should look forward to. And we're going to behold a transfiguration like this, and we're going to participate in it. Peter referenced this something similar in 2 Peter 3, I think it is. 2 Peter 1, I'm sorry. But he also uses the term that was used here where they were preparing Jesus for his departure, which was going to happen at Jerusalem. That's the same language that Peter uses later instead of death. Interestingly, Peter is one of the eyewitnesses, so he has given us another account, which we see up here. He's also one of the three that's present at the garden and the transfiguration, and he's also looking forward to resurrection after death. This shows us that one of Christ's closest disciples was looking forward to his earthly demise because he had faith beyond a shadow of a doubt with his relationship with the Lord. And this is the type of mindset that we should all have as Christians. We should not be fearing death, but looking forward to it. He wasn't concerned about dying. He was ready and actively, in his last hours, trying to help encourage other Christians. Next thing we see, got ahead. The next thing we see is Peter in verse 30 offering to build 3 tents or 3 tabernacles. Peter often speaks first and thinks about what he said a few seconds later. I'm guilty of this. In his defense, he did just wake up from a nap. But it doesn't seem to be like a selfish motive. It doesn't appear that way. He didn't really grasp what was going on. That's very, very evident. But Peter says it's good for them to be there. Again, I don't think this was a selfish thing. I think this was more like it's advantageous for us to be here to witness this great thing. And since he only suggested 3 tents, there is a possibility that he was doing this as a way to honor those 3, if not even worship them. But if there was anything to that, which I'm not saying there was, but even if there was, immediately the voice from the cloud came out and dispelled any notion of that and said, no, this is my son, not them. I think most likely it was good intention. The text says that when the cloud overshadowed them, they became afraid. But a couple of questions for thought. Who entered the cloud? Was it just Moses and Elijah? Was it Moses, Elijah, and Jesus? Was it all 6 of them? I don't think it was all 6 of them, because it says that the voice came out of the clouds, sounding like it's talking out of the cloud to the disciples. But at some point, as Gary had said, this is when Moses and Elijah left. Because we do see next that Jesus is standing alone. Who can we assume pretty confidently that the voice out of the cloud is?
God.
Thank you, Ryan. Yes, I was getting worried. Yes, we can safely assume that this is God speaking. Again, this is one of the main purposes, if not the main purpose, of this transfiguration being recorded in our Bible. Basically, to wrap up this section before we take any questions or comments, the voice out of the cloud, again, is the most significant in the entire scene. It's spoken in the presence of Moses and Elijah. It gives Jesus the preeminence over the law and the prophets. And it was done in the presence of witnesses who would be crucial to shaping the early church. Are there any questions or comments before we move on from here? Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, going back to the
Which conversation?
So, you had said that we're not sure that it was Moses or Elijah talking to them?
No, I'm very sure of that. No, I was saying, how did they know at the time that this was Moses and Elijah? Was it based on the conversation that Moses, Elijah, and Jesus were having? He called them Elijah, or he called him Moses? I was just kind of asking a generic question. Gary?
You brought up a good point about Peter, I thought, and he offered 3 shelters, and so you ask yourself, why shelters? Why not something else? Why not a stone, a statue, or something to commemorate that they were there? And the only thing I can think of, I go back and look at shelters, it's the Festival of Tabernacles, which was to commemorate the Exodus from Egypt, and that's possibly what he could have been thinking of when he brought up and suggested such shelters.
I saw that in the studies, and I wasn't sure if that was correct or not, because I didn't want to be assuming, but yes, that is another possible explanation for that. So, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Let's go back to Second Peter chapter 1, because I think there's a couple of critical things in there that Peter identifies about this. Because we look at the transfiguration of Christ, and we think what an amazing event, for these apostles, who typically are the inner circle of Jesus to give a witness to this. But when you go back, Peter clearly identifies that it's God, the Father, who is speaking. And he references this in verse 17. He says, "For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and a voice was borne to him by the majestic glory, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. We ourselves heard this voice, born from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain. And we have the prophetic word more fully confirmed, to which you will do well to pay attention as a light shining in a dark place until the daylight, or the day dawns and the morning star that rises in your heart." What Peter's really saying in 2 Peter chapter 1 is, as wonderful as the transfiguration was, we did not miss anything by not getting to witness that ourselves. It was a great event. But he points to the fact that on the other side of transfiguration, and I think Peter's speaking well after the fact here, obviously, as he's a dying man in this book, he's saying, listen, at this point in time, you have the prophetic word made more sure. In other words, it was made more sure after the fact of the transfiguration than it was during.
Right.
So we have something greater from the standpoint of we have more witness, because now Jesus is the culmination, the fulfillment of every single prophecy. If you think about the conversation that Jesus had with the apostles after his resurrection, what did he do? He went through the entire Psalms and prophets and identified how they spoke of him. And so when Peter's saying, this is something I want to leave you with as a dying man, he wants us to understand and have full confidence in this word that we have been given, that we can have full faith and trust in, as much as or more than the apostles who got to hear the voice of the Father say, "This is my beloved Son, hear him."
Yeah, the eyewitness accounts after the resurrection, I think this was recorded because anytime that God takes the time to speak, especially concerning his Son, I think that's an important thing. And yes, we do realize that this is God. That's why I was kind of asking a sarcastic question. Who can we assume that the voice was? But that's a great point. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions or comments at this time about the Transfiguration? All right. Well, then we will move on. If you want, let's skip ahead to chapter 17 and look at some verses on humility in the Gospel of Luke. Starting in verse 1, he said to his disciples, "It is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to him through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea, than that he would cause one of these little ones to stumble. Be on your guard. If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times a day and returns to you 7 times, saying, I repent, forgive him. The apostle said to the Lord, increase our faith. And the Lord said, if you had faith like a mustard seed, you would say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Which of you, having a slave, plowing or tending his sheep, will say to him, when he has come in from the field, come immediately and sit down and eat? But will he not say to him, prepare something for me to eat, and properly clothe yourself, and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you may eat and drink? He does not thank the slave because he did the things which were commanded, does he? So you too, when you do all the things which you were commanded, you say, we are unworthy slaves. We have done only that which we ought to have done. While he was on his way to Jerusalem, he was passing between Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered the village, 10 lepers who stood at a distance met him. And they raised their voices, saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. And when he saw them, he said to them, go and show yourselves to the priests. And as they were going, they were cleansed. Now one of them, when he saw that he had been healed, turned back, glorifying God with a loud voice. And he fell on his face at his feet, giving thanks to him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered and said, were there not 10 lepers cleansed? But the 9, where are they? No one was found who returned to give glory to God except for this foreigner. And then he said, stand up and go. Your faith has made you well. The context of this goes back to chapter 15. And this is where the Pharisees are upset with Jesus. They were grumbling. Now the tax collectors and sinners were coming near him to listen to him. Both the Pharisees and scribes began to grumble, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. Of all the things in the New Testament, in the gospel specifically, this is harped on by Jesus quite often. This is a big issue. The religious leaders of that time thought that they were above everybody else. They were above reproach. They looked down on others that weren't just like them. Even though they were also guilty, just as guilty as everyone else, of not keeping the law perfectly. They just couldn't understand that they had an equal share in death because of sin. They were also in the need of Jesus's. Here we see Jesus teaching 3 parables, showing God's care and concern for the lost. If the Pharisees had the eyes to see and the ears to hear, they would have understood that. But their hearts were hardened, and they thought that they were well and not in need of the physician. The more they were concerned with earthly gain and acknowledgement, the less they were concerned with eternity and God's kingdom. In these parables, he taught his disciples that they should guard themselves against becoming like the Pharisees. He loved his disciples, and he also loved the Pharisees. Even knowing that these would be the people that would destroy him, he did still love them. The gospel is for everyone, and it was back then as well. Let's take a closer look at some of these parables. I put all 3 of them up there and then added the increase in faith. Temptations to sin and forgiving the brother. Why do people sin? Why have you sinned?
We're selfish.
Selfish? Selfish for what?
We're centered on the
Things that we want. Okay. What if the things that we want are in accordance with God's will? It's no longer sin, right? Even if that's what the self wants, is something that is in accordance with God's will, then it's no longer sin.
Well, you can do the right thing for the wrong reason.
That's true. Yes, selfish desire. After being tempted by selfish desire, we give birth to sin. We know there's stumbling blocks along the way of life. None of us are perfect, but we need to strive to perfect ourselves along this path. Sometimes we do fall short. It's it's interesting that this parable starts out by saying, woe to whom the one through these temptations come. Jesus is literally saying it's better to die this crushing death at the bottom of the sea than to cause someone else to stumble in sin. And that is scary. That's scary because that shows how serious God is on this position of not causing other people to sin. If you think about things that could cause somebody to sin, I know I've been guilty of things where I've thought about it later and I'm like, man, I hope I didn't do this wrong, or I hope I didn't cause them to be upset about this. And that's something that we should be proactively thinking about ahead of time instead of after the fact. If we do everything out of love, we should never be causing somebody else to stumble. Shouldn't be. But to Mike's point, sometimes you can do the wrong thing out of the right motive. We do need to be uplifting each other and helping each other overcome our struggles. It's one of the main impacts of the church, one of the blessings. That's why we see Jesus say here to pay attention to yourself, be on guard. One day that we will give an account, not people giving an account for us. To the other side of this, if your brother has wronged you or sinned against you, we're supposed to rebuke him. Matthew 6:14 says, Jesus says, for if you forgive others in their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. Can it be uncomfortable to rebuke a brother? Even if they've wronged you, can it be uncomfortable? Have any of you ever had to do that? That's a horrible feeling. Paul writes in Galatians 6 that it's an act of love to reprove another. So we need to get over ourselves and our uncomfortability, and we need to be willing to talk with things with others. Every single person here is a baptized believer, is a fellow heir in the kingdom. We need to look at each other that way. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say, this is a really tough passage for, well, I'll just speak about myself personally, because being a stumbling block is one thing, but when you are doing something that isn't sinful, it can still be a stumbling block for a brother. You know, if it's like something, a temptation to deal with, I can't think of a good example right now, but it's really hard. So that's just another reason why it's so important to get to know each other, you know, so we can learn what, you know, what am I weak, you know, you can help me with by, you know, your example and that kind of stuff. But it's just, I don't know, stumbling blocks are really kind of tough for me because we can do things that, well, we can also sin and not realize that we have sinned, right? David prayed for his secret sins, you know, so it's really hard to, I don't know, this whole section is tough for me to.
It is a difficult section. Let me ask another uncomfortable question. It says that if our brother repents, that we forgive them. How do we know he's repenting? Are we supposed to judge his heart or take him at face value? If he comes to you and says, hey, I really messed up, I'm sorry, we just take the face value?
It's not our place to judge their hearts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is not our place to judge their hearts. We do need to forgive. There's plenty of things that we've done, and we need forgiveness on. Yes, sir.
It's also important to be wise. There are such things as sociopaths. There's such things as people who have severe psychological problems. And so the idea is can you forgive them? Yes, you should. And you should forgive them mostly for your sake and for God's sake. But then that does not mean you do not prepare yourself in case something else happens.
Right.
The pedophile, I wouldn't trust it. Once you recognize somebody's a pedophile, I wouldn't trust them with my children anymore.
Absolutely not.
That's one of the things you need to be smart.
Right, I do think there is a fine line between forgiveness and completely being goofy. But yes, in that case, no. But yeah, God judges our hearts. We're not supposed to judge other people's hearts. There are, in the case of somebody that's a sociopath or has some sort of psychological, we should look at them with an idea that, you know, they have something wrong and have compassion on that as well. But again, don't put it out in a situation that could be bad. Yes, sir.
Let's be a little careful, because Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and we need to be, you know, he comes up with a list of people that we would otherwise kind of say, yeah, I think I'm going to probably keep a little bit of arm's length distance between those people. And he says, such were some of you. Everyone can change. So we need to be a little careful, you know, once somebody does something, doesn't mean forever they are that. So we need to be a little cautious.
I would agree with that as well.
Take that too far.
I would agree with that as well. I think Kenny was specifically talking about a certain type of
I
thing.
think even in those situations.
Well,
I have one that's meeting in my house right now.
I probably won't have my kids hang out with one.
Among a whole big congregation, we formed a small nucleus around him so that we can provide a safe place.
I think that's
But if we
fantastic.
always, if we're not careful, we write people like that off.
We should not write people like that off. I agree with that. Thank you guys for your time and attention this evening.